this is a subject that I am often deeply vexed by. I am someone who both grew up on Oscar Wilde banging the drum of art for art's sake, and then fell in love with George Eliot, who Nietzsche infamously called a moralistic little female. And I feel like the two tensions of me that I deal with as a writer often are the aesthetic and the moral, and figuring out how they relate to each other. So both from your book and from your sort of writing about art, about literature, I get a sense that this is something, Natasha, that you and I share. And so I'm delighted to talk about it.
I've
Uh,
read enough of your novels now with Social Creature and the first half of your new one here in Avalon to confirm that I think we definitely share this.
so I guess I want to start with a bit of framing. I think when we talk about literary moralism, particularly in 2024,
Mhm.
it seems that what that is a shorthand for a certain kind of discursive mode or approach to literature that's perhaps best exemplified by Becca Rothfeld, who wrote an article called Sanctimony Lit, particularly about Rooney, in particular, about Sally Rooney's writing, where the idea of literary moralism in this more slightly pejorative uh, contemporary iteration seems to be about kind of saying the right things and having sort of certain characters either represent the right views or represent the right categories and be punished and rewarded accordingly. There's a sort of a kind of neo version of Clarissa. Is it Clarissa or Pamela that's virtue rewarded? It's Clarissa, right? But the sort of like 18th century virtue rewarded novel, but for 2024. So I'm curious, when you think of literary moralism, does it what does that mean for you, both in terms of a sort of contemporary iteration and a wider question of what if any should moralism in literature or morality in literature look like apart from that?
Yeah. So I think it's such an important distinction because I would draw a pretty clear line between moral fiction and moralistic fiction. And
Mhm.
I would actually say that The Portrait of Emir could be called moral fiction. It asks moral questions. It's pondering. I think that when the difference between moral and moralistic comes when you cross a line into propaganda, and specifically the telltale in contemporary literature, I think, is usually when some kind of fourth wall with the author, him or herself, gets broken to the point where it's really clear that the work of art isn't a work of art because what it's actually trying to do is make the author look good in some way. And by extension, the reader look good for reading it. And I think that that is a very specific aim that, probably has some antecedents in the 18th and 19th century, but it's not George Eliot. George Eliot's writing moral fiction, not moralistic fiction.
I think that's for me. I absolutely agree, and it's something that I find very difficult, precisely because I think as someone like you is committed to the idea that art ought to be moral or ask moral questions. Often I feel like the debate between the aesthetic fiction and the moral fiction gets boiled down to basically like woke versus anti-woke,
Yeah.
particularly in contemporary culture. Are you having a character, a book about like privilege and social issues, or are you having a sort of intentionally transgressive book that gets away with its transgressiveness by saying like, haha, like we're owning the libs, both of which don't feel like they're asking serious moral questions.
Which that dichotomy has never made sense for me as like a raging Rawlsian liberal. Like, you know what I'm saying? And I've actually been, you know, called out in various places. Oh, she's so conservative. It's like, what are you talking about? I am politically I'm as progressive as they come, but there is I think I think it's really unfortunate that this attitude toward art is getting paired with a political position in the real world, because what I'm actually, arguing for is that you don't need to take a political position in fiction one way or another. By the way, I personally think it's really, really clear how liberal I am from reading portrait, but that's not the point. The point is that the author really should be, I mean, they're never going to be irrelevant, but you should try and make yourself as small as possible from an egoic perspective specifically. And that's what I mean in like the first tenet of my little, we're talking about manifestos and lists, and the first one on mine: success generally rests on disarming the very cognitive defense mechanisms designed to protect one's fragile psyche. Like, that is that specific sort of disinterest is like a barrier or a wall between what you, not so much what you think, but what you think other people will think about you for writing something. And that is the piece that you've got to, that took me personally a year before I really started generating any material that wound up in the Portrait of Amir. That was my first task, was cultivating this extremely specific brand of disinterest, because it's not totally disinterested. It's sort of related to, I mean, I don't know if you've ever like been on a train and like looking out the window, and then you like imagine you're an actor and like you see the director's view of you looking out the window and like what they would think. It's kind of akin to taking more a directorial perspective, but like really making that actor someone else, not someone you're trying to make good or look good, but someone you're just trying to see, not independent of morals in terms of, because like moral questions are fine, but in terms of like prescriptive moral answers. The most interesting aesthetic literature asks ambiguous questions. It doesn't like tell you the answer.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's funny hearing you talk, the degree to which the idea of being conscious of being perceived, and the way, and like the actor or the person who is a sort of actor in the drama of their own life is a kind of death knell to being a writer. And I find it sort of so fascinating, having just read a novel that is all about mimetic desire and characters whose sense of themselves in the eyes of others determines their actions and their sense of their own selves. How much you can't do that if you're actually writing a book.
That's
Uh,
right. That's
and
right.
precisely, and I relate to this a lot. Avalon took me forever to write, precisely because it was it was my third novel, and both my second and my third novel, but I wrote my second novel in COVID, so it was a little different. But by Avalon, that sense of, well, I know how my first novel has been received, and I know what literary discourse is, and I'm a working writer now, and I know the people whose job it is to brand this book, and I know that, do I have the right opinions? If I don't have the right opinions, how do I defend against, accusations? And often in my brain there was like every single Twitter person who might possibly be mad at me for anything I'd written in any book that I felt like I had to kind of preemptively justify myself against. And it seems like a lot of what you talk about as this sort of act, presentative perspective is very much a kind of morality as self-justification.
Yeah. Well, we should talk about that specifically, because I actually got off Twitter in no small part because of that. I'm not anti-social media any more than just anyone is. Like I, we all sort of have to be on it a little bit as writers. It's really hard to avoid, but I I think that Twitter or X now is, it always gave me way more anxiety than the other platforms, more than Instagram, certainly more than Substack. And, I think it's because like every potential moment on Twitter, it's just built for virality more than any other platform. And I don't know if this has really changed, to be honest, because I haven't been on there since, I don't know, like last April or May, but um it, I found it to be like a huge distraction coming, especially coming out of the writing stage of portrait and into the marketing stage, and like, oh, I guess I have to do this. I've never really liked Twitter, even though I'd had an account for a long time. And you know, you don't have to do all of them as a writer. You can pick and choose a little bit. Personally, I like Substack the best by wide margins. I think it allows for depth, but I don't hate Instagram either. In fact, I probably should hate it more. There's a whole Instagram chapter in my book. It is that it's been too influential, if that makes sense.
So I want to ask you about the relationship of your sort of 10 tips, your manifesto to the writing of your novel.
Yeah.
I can see sort of thematically, there is such a great deal of overlap, both in terms of uh, your novel, certainly the was is it number 4 about the great novelist revealing the imitative nature of desire. That's a quote from Renee Girard. That one seems very on the nose, but also something that interested me is while you do have these very experimental or sort of mixed media chapters. There's whole chapters that are emails or Instagram. Structurally, it is an extremely traditional novel. It's a very novelly novel. It reminds me a lot of Iris Murdoch in particular, where there's sort of these sort of interludes of emotional discord and discourse interspersed with sort of scenes that are dramatic in ways that feel very tight and structured. So I know it's a bit of a chicken or the egg question, but were these sense did your sense of what a novel ought to be get sort of calcified in the writing of Mirror, or did you sort of start with these are the principles I have in my head and I want to write a novel along these lines?
I think it's really a mix. I had a very strong perspective of the themes that I was interested in and the thematic architecture of the novel around recursion, innovation, mythology, and glamour. I had a very strong sense that the character of Julian would be just 100% based on my late friend Evan, no alterations, direct quotes from life. And that, speaks to number 2, that truly unbelievable people are the only one. Everyone else has to be a composite because, most, if you're going to make a fictional character seem specific enough to be real, it actually has to be a little bit overdone. So the really overdone people that you can sometimes just straight up lift. Now there's the whole ethical question there. I really didn't have it in this case because number 1, my friend was dying by the time I started writing the novel, and he was very, very excited to be a character in my book. But that can be, obviously we've seen like Bad Art Friend and all, things where it really, really can get into ethical quandary territory. The one about like reading the novelists that you wanted to imitate, that for me is like extremely long standing. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on James Joyce and T.S. Eliot as Ulysses in the Wasteland as like the twin you know pillars of modernism, by rejecting a lot of modernism's like normal tenets that that's how they found their path to exemplifying the movement that in many ways uh, they were outside in informal ways. And so that I always believed very, very strongly that reading was much, much more important than like writing classes. This also comes from my father, who was a English professor and had his view on MFAs was about as unflattering as you can possibly imagine. And I absolutely inherited some of that. I think MFAs are fantastic for people who are low on mimetic desire and get a really good stipend, and you just don't listen to anyone and you read and write. There's certain people that have clearly like benefited from that. I'm way too high on mimetic desire. I would have been a disaster in an MFA program. I would have tried to be exactly like one of my professors or something. And it was just, unnecessary. Like you, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything that you would get from that that you can't get from reading Anna Karenina yourself. The way to learn how to write a novel is to read a lot of novels. And if you want to write a good one, need to read really, really good ones. This is, by the way, is another thing that I just could not stand about Twitter. Like every so often there would be some inane argument about like whether or not writers need to read. And it's like, I can't even countenance that level of stupidity.
No, I mean, it's funny. I also come from a kind of more academic background. I also don't have an MFA, and for me, the training that I felt that I had was reading the novels, sort of
Yeah.
the canon seems too highfalutin a thing to say, but
No, no,
as
it doesn't.
that
I don't think it
I'm
seems like too highfalutin a thing to say. You,
but to
no
be
one
in
has ever said
a
anything
dialogue.
that I thought was too highfalutin.
But the sense that this is a kind of dialogue that is being had, that every, I mean, it's something that I picked up on in your novel, like, which is not just the kind of formal use of myth, but the way, you have these sort of offhand lines, and there is something very Eliot-esque, and like you've got like that quote, you've got a quote from Middlemarch just sort of like hidden in there, sort of in an indirect discourse. Got with Stillman's Metropolitan, which so maybe isn't quite canon, but is for me. Yeah,
It's canon.
but there is a sense in which something that I mean, your novel is not, well, one of the characters is an aspiring writer, but it is not the stereotypical novel about writers who want to write a novel.
That's
And
right.
yet it does seem very much like, more than almost any novel I've read recently that's not about writers, a novel about writing, perhaps because it is a novel about mimetic desire. But it seems to be that both on the level of kind of form and structure, you are retelling the myth of Narcissus,
Mhm.
and then kind of highlighting it by the fact that uh, there is an art exhibit about the myth of Narcissus where a lot of the plot takes place at the Met, but also in terms of the sort of way that you play with language and bring up uh, the canon, even as you sort of work in Instagram posts and Overheard in New York. That seems to be a profoundly not just a generous approach, but a sense that all novels are kind of part of the same river, or all good novels are part of the same river.
This
And
comes
so
from Joyce.
this is that wasn't a question. Although leading into the
Oh,
question, that
it's fine.
sorry, that was more of a comment than a question. But I guess a curiosity I have then is, where does the, I mean, I have, strong positive moral feelings about your novel, and yet where does the art for art's sake, like, what are we talking about when we talk about useless art, or art for art's sake, when we're talking about the novel? We're not
Yeah.
talking about something, you know a pretty piece of art to hang in our, living room, and we're not talking about a sort of pleasant piece of music. What is the, where does the aesthetic even come in a novel?
Oh, I mean, I do think it derives from its fundamental use, like lack of utility in, that in that very, real coal mining sort of sense. And the I'm trying to think of how to explain it. So you've stumped me with all of the like pulling in of everyone else's stuff. I've always called that the synthetic aesthetic, and the roll up of like incorporating all of the canonical art uh, is probably related on some level to wanting to works that have stood the test of time. It comes back to artistic immortality too, I think, right? And the subject of that exhibition itself, that it is part of being human. It is self-justifying, and it comes back to asking the questions too about why we're doing this, uh, and not and it not being prescriptive, it not being propaganda. I think, again, the dichotomy of good art isn't bad art. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as bad art. It's like not art.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. I mean, I guess you could, that's a question of semantics, but I don't know if that's a satisfying answer for that particular question, but it's very much the wild. It's the wild approach of there. It doesn't need to be defended or explained, that its existence and beauty, maybe beauty and truth is really what it comes down to, that a work of art that is beautiful, that is true, and in the novelistic sense, not in the factual sense, requires no defense for its being.
I think that's something that 13-year-old Oscar Wilde worshiping Tara didn't necessarily get, that art for art's sake felt like the beat stress was on the art and the art. And in increasingly this idea that it exists for not for itself in a selfish way, but that it does not need to defend itself, that it does not need to produce a specific response or action, or like, you know, convert someone to the cause of communism, or
Right.
have you, that whatever is good in a work of art is good, kind of regardless of whether it inspires a particular action or a particular sentiment. But then, I mean, I kind of I convinced myself there, but then when George Eliot has that quote, I think it was one of her letters, that if art does not enlarge empathy or sympathy, nothing does. And that's the part where I'm always a little bit torn, because I think the idea that like it's you're drinking your green juice and you're reading your book to get your empathy, and if you read enough George Eliot you'll get enough empathy points to be a more empathetic person, seems to instrumentalize how good Daniel's Deronda is or Middlemarch is. And yet at the same
Yeah.
time, it does seem that like there are capacities in us that good art awakens. So I always find myself
The
torn.
way, sorry, I didn't mean to
Oh no,
interrupt.
no,
I thought you're
I
done.
want to know, help me be untorn.
Yeah, yeah. Here's how I think you can be untorn. Art does all of that stuff too, secondarily, and not by necessity. So interestingly, when my little manifesto first came out in, I guess it was 2022, of all people, Margaret Atwood shared it, because, which is, very interesting, given, I mean, it cites her, but also because, like, few novelists are held up more as, like, not so much even as their work being productive to social change. And like they can be, but that can't be the underlying point. That is secondary. And it is, and you know art doesn't have to do that. It can, and it can do it really, really gracefully. And there are wonderful, super political novels. I love The Handmaid's Tale. I think it's an incredible work of art. But then, read those sentences. You're not when you're reading that book, when you're talking about that book in abstract, maybe you're talking about, reproductive justice, and it's great that it spurns that conversation. But when you're reading that book, you are in it, right? Like, it is the aesthetics, the she doesn't fall prey to what we talked about first around, that specific egoic uh posture of, like, look at me, Margaret Atwood. I'm so good and I have such good opinions about reproductive justice. There isn't a whiff of that in her novels.
Before I ask the next question, just a note of housekeeping for all of you on the call. We're going to at some point switch to Q&As, but if you have questions now, please do drop them in the chat. And what we'll do in about 10 minutes or so is keep talking, look at the questions that are in the chat, turn to those first, and then y'all will have the opportunity, if you should so wish, to ask questions by either raising your little hand icon and ask, or just talking and asking them in person, or over Zoom verbally, as you like. So if anything is already on your mind, or something comes up in this conversation, please do drop that in. Then I know a lot of people who are at the salon we have all met at the Renee Girard conference. But for those of you who haven't, or even for those of us who need a refresher, I'd love to hear a little bit more about uh, Girard's theory of mimetic desire and why you think it's so important for the novel specifically and for the novelist.
Well, it feels wrong for me to talk about this with Trevor on the call, to be honest, or Luke for that matter. I feel like I don't know, I'm going to use a Catholic metaphor. I feel like I'm one of those saints lecturing to God or something. But
In your own work, maybe
in
if you
my
wanted to
own
say,
words,
let's talk about your approach, just to keep
okay,
it away from
in my own words, Girard in Deceit, Desire in the novel gave me a flawless vocabulary to talk about ideas that I had reached independently, and that my book, that the process of writing my novel was a process of working out and discovering.
I'm I mean, it is something that just kept coming back to me in your actually Sherry, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Natasha. Um, oh, like the author sometimes voices their own opinions through the characters. I find that a work of fiction instantly falls flat when it feels like the character, like the sole existence of a character is for the author to say something they want to say. Like this might as well have been a nonfiction, but you wanted to make it a novel. I get that feeling sometimes. But as someone who is trying to write fiction, I find it very difficult because how do you create a character that seems basically how do you create a character that doesn't seem like this is just Sherry saying what she believes? Like how does it mean you have to make them uh morally ambiguous? Like I think George R. R. Martin does he does a really good job of creating those characters in Game of Thrones, but I don't know how to I don't know if that's like a formula I should follow.
I'm not sure there's a formula. What I will say is I don't the the author expressing their thoughts through characters is sort of inevitable. I will tell you in the Portrait of Emir, almost all of Vivian's curatorial lectures were drawn almost verbatim from college papers that I wrote. So, there are ways to do and not do it. Let's take another someone better than me, Tolstoy, famously just kind of plops a philosophical treatise in at the beginning or the middle, the end of a novel, and oftentimes it still works. So, I don't think that it's a whole there are no total in terms of the craft side that people like to talk about, which I would say this gets close to. I don't think there are any totalizing rules. There's only good execution and bad execution. And it's okay to use characters as a vehicle for your ideas if you have been able, if you're using it to work it out and not egoically, what you want to expunge isn't the ideas, it is the egoic connection of those ideas to yourself.
Okay. I think this will come to me with time, but thank you.
It took me a really long time. It would, like I said, this was the challenge, the hurdle to writing anything. I'd written the first page of many things, but I'd never even written a short story. And then suddenly, after a year of battling this and just getting over myself, it started to work.
Thank you.
Of course.
It's interesting to think about these two sort of elements of our conversation that I'd held apart until we started having this conversation, Natasha. The one being the sort of imitative desire and the other being moralism and self-justification. But the more we talk, the more it seems that there is a kind of like the call to unselfing of the novelist is very much a call to kind of resist every form of self-justification and create characters, whether they're similar to us, different from us, share our ideas, don't share ideas, but kind of exist independently of our egos. And that doesn't mean they can exist independently of our ideas or of our talent. And we are still writing them. But there is, I think, the worst books, the worst novels, are those that are constantly trying to prove themselves. It's the equivalent of this is a for those of you who spend a lot of time on Reddit, like, am I the asshole posts? And someone's always trying to has done something kind of, there's a morally complex situation, but someone's trying to tell it in a way that makes them sound the like they're not they're in the right and the other person's in the wrong. And there's a reason that like am I the asshole posts are the opposite of great literature. And I think it's precisely because, a text that someone sort of telling a story about, whether it's about themselves or it's sort of obliquely about themselves, is a story about how you're right, and other people are wrong. And it seems that the best novels are ones where everyone has a sort of there is no one who can be completely right, no one can be completely wrong because they're about human beings, but also that they might be specific to our obsessions. Natasha, I noticed a lot of places in New York and particular references that made this book feel extremely specific.
I mean, we both like the Carlisle.
Yeah, the Carlisle. I'm guessing Harry's is based on Dorian's, which about
Harry's is absolutely based on Dorian's Red
two,
Hand. Yes,
3 blocks from my house. But I at the same time, I think there's it seems such an interesting tension that the novelist has to kind of resolve, where on the one hand you have to get rid of a certain kind of ego in order to let characters be who they are, and yet the specificity of your own interest and your obsessions are what make, this novel your novel. And I could not have written your novel, you could not have written my novel, and none of us could have written Trevor's novel. And
right.
precisely because, and so I'm curious how, when writing, particularly something that is based in part on your own experience, how you decide what is the kind of like good self-indulgence of like specificity and passion, and what's the bad self-indulgence of self-justification or egoism.
Yeah, oh gosh, it's such a fine line, right? I personally, I think that a really like maybe what's been helpful for me is details are, character details, ticks, setting, really big on using firsthand knowledge of setting. You're going to be able to describe things you've experienced firsthand better. And this gets to the voluminous research Franzen point too. Anybody can look up anything on the internet now, which, makes those kind of firsthand details in the, environment, often really, really compelling. the bad stuff, it's not just the I'm an asshole. So I completely agree with everything you said 100%. But to add to it, and sometimes maybe this goes back to Sherry's question and can be a like specific actionable point to, get through that stage. I think on the route to disinterest, not uninterest, is sometimes you start out arguing that you're right. Sometimes there's then a tendency to be too hard on yourself, to argue that you're in the wrong. And I will say, full disclosure, my novel got a lot of flack for not going hard enough on my characters. But sometimes I think that this can be a helpful route to like be too hard on yourself, to try and balance out your natural desire to go too easy on yourself not as a final destination, because being too self-deprecating is both, novelistically dishonest and, its own kind of egoism if you look at comics too. But if it helps you get to true neutral, which is where I think you want to sit, then it's worth maybe trying or indulging to like look at yourself in the worst possible light. I've actually said this in the past, that my 4 main characters, they're all composites, that they're like, the 4 worst versions of myself. And I think that was probably like a really good line to give in, my book talks and stuff. But if I'm being honest, it's probably, more neutral. I'm relatively nice to them. And I was really, really trying to get to neutral.
So I'm conscious we've got about 20 minutes left, so I do want to turn it over to Q&A and discussion.
Yeah.
So the one question we have on the stack is from David. How would you characterize Vanity Fair on the moralistic spectrum?
I can't comment, David. I haven't read it. It's on my shelf. I know I need to read it. Don't yell at me. Like, not everybody can read everything.
I'll weigh in
please, you weigh in.
Just for time, while I encourage all of the rest of you to think of some questions, and we'll get into it in a bit. I'm curious to hear, particularly from those of you who are novelists or who want to be novelists, who are writing about some of the way these tensions come up in your own work. So I invite both questions and comments, unlike many. Yeah, this is the rare time that you can ask a question that is a comment. But Vanity Fair, I think, is really interesting because it feels like it takes the architecture of the 18th century moralist novel and subverts it. That you have these 2 characters who are exemplary of different moral trajectories, and they, you have the good stupid one and the bad take no prisoners one. Fun fact, apparently Gone with the Wind was loosely based on Vanity Fair in terms of like a lot of its plot architecture. But you do have this image of the 2 of them at the end, kind of looking at each other across a table at a charity fair, in exactly the same place. And yet I don't think this is a sense that these 2 women are morally equivalent, so much of a sense that these are women who are living in the world, and in a very complicated world, such that virtue is not always rewarded and vice is not always punished. And yet nor is virtue always punished and vice rewarded, that there's a kind of complexity that allows these 2 women at the end of the book to be just 2 people who are doing kind of okay. But I think that wouldn't work as well as it does, or land as hard as it does, if there wasn't a sense that we were playing with the idea of the moralist novel, waiting for either Becky to get her comeuppance or to kind of ascend to the very peak of the social heap. So Gwen,
Yeah,
question.
I'm
And then whoever, and then David after Gwen, or actually,
Yeah.
David, is your comment about Vanity Fair?
Um,
Which case, David.
no,
Okay.
I was gonna ask a different question.
Okay. In which case, Gwen, why don't you take it away, and then we'll go back to David.
Okay, sounds good.
So Natasha, you talked about how for the first year you kind of had to, I think the words you used were get over yourself, like write your way to like, get over your own ego. I'm kind of in the process of trying to do that. How did you can you explain kind of psychologically, psychoanalytically how you accomplished that? Or was it kind of just an unconscious like loosening?
I don't think I knew what I was doing while I was doing it. So a lot of what I was doing was just trying to write and spending a lot of time at blank or near blank screens, just thinking. A lot of time was spent on diagrams that make me look like a psychopath, around my 4 themes and my 4 main characters and all of the, neat architectural ways they were going to intersect and intercept. A lot of it was just, thinking about the plot, and I had like 60-70% of it worked out by the time I like got over myself and really started to draft. But I wouldn't, at the time, I don't think I would have said what I was doing was trying to get over myself. I think what I would have said what I was doing was experimenting with, different forms, different different voices. Landing on the voice is really, I think that's probably what I would have said that I was doing. I was trying to find the voice of the novel at the same time as fleshing out my thematic architecture and, starting to solidify the plot in a pretty organic way. I'm not like I don't know everything that's going to happen. That's part of the fun of, going through, is figuring it out as you go. I don't know how helpful that is or not, but it's just time sitting there and reading a lot. This is actionable. I reread Anna Karenina. I reread the Picture of Dorian Gray. I read I read The Portrait of a Lady for the first time. I read a lot of Wharton toward the end, actually. That was toward the end. But those 3 novels were like the really, because I knew, enough about them to know, based on the type of novel that I wanted to write, what historical canonical works were going to be most helpful thematically. And reading at that level dead people who you're not going to be jealous of is the best thing you can do when you're in that early stage, because you're like in your mind, you're hearing the right sort of voice, the cadence. Tara mentioned that, my novel reads like a novel-y novel, but those interspersed, like more playful sections, I realized that I was never going to be able to sell a novel that dense without some kind of white space to break it up and give it like literal levity. So, and a lot of, while not very much of the material, I don't think any of the material from that first year actually made it into the final text because the voice was off. Like, doing something that was, a phone script and doing something that was in Instagram captions, like those were things that I experimented with very, very early.
No,
Is
that's
that
really
helpful?
helpful. Thank you. No, that all of it, including the abstract stuff, is very helpful.
Good.
David, you're up, and then we've got a couple in the chat after that.
Sure, quick comment. Natasha, I think you were pretty hard on your characters at the end, but I won't spoil the plot. I think you were hard.
Well, can we spoil the plot? Has anyone not read? Because I don't think it's a super spoilable. I mean, it's a little bit spoilable.
I'll just
but not
say
super.
the word unrequited.
Yeah,
I think that alone was kind of hard on the characters. But anyway, I have a question about Renee Girard, who I'm wrestling with. How do you prevent yourself from having him as your mediator? Like,
You should really, number one, you need to subscribe to Trevor's new newsletter and like the tome he published today, because literally he goes through all of this. Gerard was never my mediator, so I haven't had to deal with that directly. I haven't had a direct envy of him, because
well, not so
very,
much
very
envy, but the way that he talks about Don Quixote and the whoever, I forget the name, but it's sort of like I was reading parts of Deceit, Desire, Desire, Deceit, the novel, and I was thinking, he's like, is he the barber who always says yes to the haircut? Is he the carpenter who always sees a nail with his hammer? It just it it started to, and I know there are people on here who are, who have taken away a lot from his writing and his thought process. But I have to say, I came away with some skepticism from what I've read so far, at least based on Proust. That's a book I know well. I don't know Stendhal very well at all.
You actually don't need to know either of them. I've been, working my way through Proust recently and enjoying it immensely, and seeing Gerard on every page. So I'm actually fascinated to hear, I'm very interested to know what's like specifically you find isn't jiving. Because in many ways, I think of all Gerard's examples, Proust is like maybe the best. To me, it's so close.
Because the young Marcel is an adolescent. He's a young man, and all his imitative desires stem from how green he is, if you will, as opposed to what he's searching for. At least that's my view. Like one of my favorite quotes is, adolescence is thronged with gods and monsters. Like, see gods and monsters everywhere. So I don't want to monopolize, but maybe we could have a conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would love to. I think that greenness and mimetic desire, like unconscious, or just on the level of enacting mimetic desire, are correlated, not conflicting. But we can, I mean, we can talk about it now. We can, I don't know, Tara.
I wasn't saying it was
about
conflicting. I was just saying
Yeah.
that was like when you grow up,
Yeah.
I think you become mature, you're maybe not as prone to mimetic desire. That's what
Oh, I don't know about that. I think maybe, some probably depends on the person. I think with Proust, that is true, because he's, figuring out in novelistic terms rather than in, nonfiction mechanistic terms, but he's discovering the same thing that Gerard discovers before Gerard, right? And this is what I think is, so many, a lot of writers, Trevor, please feel free to come off mute anytime here and save me. But like, a lot of writers do have, really big challenges with this. Part of the reason I think I don't is that, like, Gerard didn't invent any of it. Lots of people have had all of the same discoveries as Gerard, basically every canonical novelist, honestly. And what Gerard did is, put a set of words to it, which I think is, fundamentally distinct from having invented.
Okay.
So we have two questions in the chat I want to get to, and then we may come back to this if we have time. But first, this one's from Meek. Meek asks, to what extent does writing around the moralistic zeitgeist, e.g., woke slash anti-woke, quickly date a work versus writing about more timeless issues expressed within the contemporary, e.g., the older books that are coming up as references in these discussions?
Well, this speaks straight to, the tradition and the individual talent point and kind of T.S. Eliot's whole shtick there. It's not, you need both. The timeless and the temporal are friends that need to meet. And that's, greatness isn't just having, just copying tradition. It's also, not just capturing a moment. It's about capturing, a moment or a time in relation to those other times in a way that it at least stands a chance at continuing to be relevant in new ones. So for me, it's all about the timeless and the temporal, and the timeless and the temporal together, and not not a split between them. I have no idea how what I would say is I don't think that moralistic fiction will not stand the test of time because it is too temporal. I think it won't stand the test of time because it's bad.
So I think this may be our last question. We may have a lightning round at the end. But Andrew asks, hi Andrew, does creating and depicting characters as full people clash with creating characters whose motivations might be incomprehensible? Is the reader being able to understand or empathize with the character and more important to them emerging as a full person?
I think after I typed this, I just want to, it clarified a little bit in my head after I typed it out there. I guess the question here is there an element of, does the character's emergence as a full person, basically the second sentence, depend on whether readers can look at them and think, oh, that's a full person. I can understand what they might be doing when they're not on screen. And if so, does that limit the kinds of good characters that can be written? Because it does seem like there are some people in real life too who just do things that are incomprehensible.
So look, it's important when you think about readers, to the extent that you want to think about readers while you're writing. I tend to, while I'm drafting early on, think just of myself as a reader. Like, what's part of the reason that I want to write is because I want to read the books that, there are books that I want to read that don't exist, and that's why, part of the reason for doing it. I want to read that sentence again, that your second sentence. Where is that? In terms of the of their motivations and the empathy. So part of the reason that I lean hard on myself is that people have different tastes. De gustibus non est disputandum, and part of Wilde's manifesto at the beginning of Picture of Dorian Gray, right above all art is quite useless, is something to the effect of divisiveness in a work of art shows that it's like new, essential, or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote, but you're never gonna please everybody. And this is, maybe this helps with the egoic thing too, like just knowing that people are going to think terrible things of you, so you might as well just say what you mean. If you are so fortunate as to publish a book. So I think that I don't think it's helpful to think about some like abstract reader, some generic reader. I think it's really helpful to think about specific readers who you want to reach. And this is one of the reasons why I think that a big early step when you're drafting, maybe when you're about a quarter or a third of the way through. At least this was true for me for portrait, and I kind of the same thing. Well, it's different with later ones because hopefully you have an agent and then your agent can just read it, which is really shortcuts it. But with the first one, you know, I sent it to a couple people to look at. And it was very, very hard to send a few chapters of a novel but I sent it to people who I really cared about their opinion. My husband, you know, I wanted to know what he thought. I sent it really early on to my friend Gia because she was at the time the only professional like writer that I knew. And you know, thinking about them as specific readers was very helpful to me. And what will, you know, not in terms of what will they think of me, but what will they think of this character? Like what questions will they have? Will this, you know, seem like a full person to them? Does it seem like someone we know? That was helpful. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah, because I definitely was trying to get at empathy in the sense of intelligibility, not in terms of likability or something narrower.
Mhm.
And so thinking about the way that a particular reader that you know well might react rather than a general reader is a really helpful frame of that. Thank you.
This is where if you haven't read Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, this is where I think Deceit, Desire, and the Novel would have been really, really helpful for me at the time and shortcut an awful an awful lot of that challenge because you know, in terms of like predicting how people by and large, I mean, of course, you know, are going to behave. Of course, there's aberrations, and understanding when things are aberrations is part of, you know, of the analysis, the social analysis that you're doing in writing. But what Deceit, Desire, and the Novel does so well is you know, walk through like the basics of human nature and how people will will behave specifically around the insight that what we want is not ex nihilo. It is determined by what, you know, other people want, basically.